Jerome Starkey, who's defence editor at The Sun, and also commentator Emma Revel. Come back to you, Jerome. Just in terms of the Cenotaph, in particular, we know so many veterans of so many wars, this elderly and more recent wars, were really, along with most of the British public, quite horrified by the scenes on Saturday outside the Cenotaph.
Indeed. I mean, the Cenotaph clearly very emotive. James Sunderland describing it as a sacred place. I mean, ultimately, though, you know, many of the things that the soldiers who are remembered at the Cenotaph fought for was freedom, and they fought for the freedom to protest. And, you know, by trying to make it a sacred place or cordon it off or say you can't protest here, essentially we are, you know, curtailing perhaps some of those central freedoms which we hold dear. And it's difficult. But
protesting, of course, it's very near Parliament. It's basically outside number 10 Downing Street, which is an obvious place to hold a protest.
And it's government, yeah.
Yeah, indeed. It's a difficult one. In terms of the BBC, though, it's fascinating that even, you know, in a meeting with our Prime Minister this morning, that the Israeli President raised the issue of the BBC and their reporting of this strike on this Gaza hospital, but also refusal to call Hamas terrorists, which the BBC is not doubling down, they're quadrupling down on this.
The BBC has made its decision. It's clearly incredibly controversial. Personally, you know, I think we are at risk of being distracted by a whole round of shoot the messenger. I mean, you know, the journalist who was live on air saying there was no other explanation other than an Israeli rocket for that explosion at the Al-Ahli hospital, you know, clearly that was a mistake. There are other potential explanations. We still don't know for certain which one is true. You know, what I think... But it
is fair for people to say you shouldn't take the word... The people saying it was a strike by the Israelis were the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, who are run by Hamas, who are a terrorist organisation, which for some reason the BBC doesn't recognise as a terrorist organisation, despite the fact it is literally a proscribed terrorist organisation. As a general rule, we may not take the word of the Israeli government or the Israeli Defence Forces, but as a general rule, I think it's a good general rule not to take the word of terrorists.
I think you're quite right. And I think in any conflict, we must be very wary of taking any one side's opinion of anything. You know?
And especially the influence the BBC has. I mean, Emma Revel around the world, certainly in the Middle East, where there are so many, you know, biased different news services, the BBC actually plays a very, very instrumental role there.
Yeah, I mean, I've come on the show before and I've defended the BBC a lot, and it gets increasingly hard to do when they do things like this, to be honest.
They create these difficulties for themselves, don't they?
They do, and I'm sure there'll be an investigation, and then the BBC will do its favourite thing of reporting on the BBC, which they love to do.
They love that.
But it does seem like this reporter just... I don't know if you would use the word misspoke or got carried away. I don't know what their justification was, but it does become increasingly frustrating when one of the greatest assets the BBC has is BBC News, BBC World Service, and the way that is held in such high regard, not just in the BBC, but across the globe. And then when you have errors like this, it becomes incredibly damaging for the BBC's reputation as an organisation as a whole.
Yeah, indeed. Can I ask you about Humza Yousaf? Come back to you first, Jerome Starkey, on this. Scottish First Minister saying, look, you know, bearing in mind his own parents-in-law are in Gaza, he's fearing for their safety. He and his wife, obviously, and the rest of the family, obviously very distraught about the fate of their family members, saying, look, we should offer basically, you know, refugee asylum to people coming from Gaza, those who do want to leave. How popular do you think that would be among the Scottish people, indeed among the British people at large?
Well, look, we've done it for the Afghan refugees who fled the Taliban takeover, particularly for people who'd helped British forces while we were there over so many years. We've done it for Ukrainian refugees fleeing the Russian onslaught. Many supporters of Palestine already feel that there's this duality, that actually the Palestinian cause and the fate of people, civilians trapped in Gaza, is not given the same weight, perhaps, as it deserves in international discourse, indeed, in the concerns of the British public and the British government. And therefore, you know, I would suggest that because we've done it in previous conflicts, and because ultimately the rights of refugees to sort of, you know, to safe passage is enshrined in international law.
But it is interesting, Emma, isn't it, that, you know, Egypt and other neighbouring countries say, no, thanks, don't want them. I mean, they've literally said, no, we don't want to have people from Gaza coming here. No other Arab country has stepped up, and the normal form is that people go to the countries nearest by. Ukrainians, the vast majority of Ukrainians have fled to Poland, the neighbouring country. Do you think it's quite telling that other Arab countries don't want people from Gaza, but should we take them in?
I think it's probably more likely that Egypt knows that they would be taking refugees in much larger numbers and for much longer periods of time. You know, if we were to take a number of refugees to the UK as a whole or to Scotland specifically, they would likely be in very small numbers, and probably you would imagine people who had family links to where they were moving to. Yeah. In Egypt's case, it is likely that it would be a lot more people, it would be a wider range of people, and they are understandably cautious about the long-term impacts of that.
And indeed, so the Muslim Brotherhood, they know what Hamas is in Israel, apologies, in Egypt. Let me come also to something that's happened here last night. King Charles gave a speech last night at the Mansion House in the City of London, and he, although he didn't mention Gaza and Israel particularly specifically, he did sort of talk about needing to calm tensions following violent protests that we have seen, urging civility and tolerance, as well as mutual understanding, and made some comments about the sort of toxic debates we have on social media. Let's have a little watch and listen of what he had to say.
Such understanding, both at home and overseas, is never more vital than at times of international turmoil and heartbreaking loss of life. It does not have to be like this. That the temptation to turn ourselves into a shouting or recriminating society must be resisted, or at least heavily mitigated whenever possible, especially in the digital sphere, where civilized debate too often gives way to rancour.
Yeah, I mean, he's not wrong, is he, Emma Revel?
No, he's definitely not wrong. I think he's identified exactly what social media can do when we get into contentious issues. Yeah. I'm particularly pleased that King Charles still feels able to speak in this way. It was something he talked a lot about as Prince of Wales, and I think it's important, whether he's listened to or not, whether people do calm down or not, to have someone who can make the case like that.
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes whether he's just talking about his own personal WhatsApp groups of the family with Harry and Meghan. I don't know. Jerome Starkey?
Well, indeed. I mean, we see it no more acutely than in a conflict like Israel-Gaza Strip, where, the feelings are so strongly held on both sides that there is a lot of shouting, a lot of screaming, a lot of decrying on social media, and not particularly helpful trying to understand what is really going on, particularly in a case like that strike on the hospital, where getting to ground truth is the most important.
Yeah. And I would have thought, again, with most people who are not so imbued with this, that they could understand it. The massacre was horrible. It was a terrorist group. It's terrible. They'll understand a little bit, but not much of the history. It's very complicated. But they'll also be fearing for innocent people in Gaza. I don't think any of these things are mutually exclusive. And I think most reasonable people can see all of that at the same time. Emma Revel, I know you're staying with us for the next half hour, but Jerome Starkey, defence editor of The Sun, you've got, I suppose, another job to get done this afternoon, so we'll let you escape the studio. Thank you so much.